Welcome to our next session, Success Factors, How to Make a Supply Chain Finance a Win-Win for Corporates with our partner, Kyriba. Just a couple reminders for the session today. All attendees have been placed on mute. If you guys have any questions throughout the presentation, you can either submit them in the chat to panelists or in the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen, and we will have time to answer those at the end. We also do have 2 poll questions throughout the presentation. Please participate because this allows us to cater the presentation to the audience today. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mike to kick it off.
All right, thanks so much, Katie. Really appreciate the opportunity today. And I'm also excited that I'll be able to present along with Alex. So just a quick introduction of myself. I joined Kyriba in June. My background is in a couple of years in the fintech side of working capital and supplier finance, but I spent most of my career working for 3 global banks. I went through JP Morgan, Bank of America, and HSBC. So I have a fair amount of experience over the years in supplier finance programs, and really looked forward to just sharing some of the learnings and some of those, like what I'm calling success factors in deploying an early payment solution for suppliers. Alex?
Great, thank you, Mike. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alex Jackson. I'm a senior consultant with Alir. I've worked with Kyriba now directly as a consultant for about 5 years, but 2 years prior to that, I was on the other side of this, where I was one of the implementation specialists setting up Kyriba from my company. So I have about 7 years of experience with Kyriba. The 3 main areas I work in are payments, connectivity, and then also supply chain finance. So I was invited to speak here as well. So Mike, if you want to take it back over. And
Yeah, you bet. And I really look forward to Alex just kind of providing that color commentary and some of those, we're going to try to get into some real world experiences as much as we can. So if you're not familiar with Kyriba, we are about a 20-year-old company with 800 employees in 20 countries. And we're really best known for liquidity and cash management. We are a SaaS platform. We have been from the beginning, but we deliver really 4 categories of solutions. It's treasury management, payments, foreign exchange, and working capital optimization or working capital management. And my role is actually on the working capital side as a subject matter expert and as a solutions structuring expert in setting up these programs and helping customers really maximize their working capital objectives. So this is the agenda that we set forth for the day or for the hour. I want to give a little bit of perspective on what I've seen in the supply chain. Some things really never change, and other things have been really kind of emphasized over the last couple of years. And then we'll go into some of the specific solutions that we offer and things that are in the market, like dynamic discounting, supply chain finance, and even a hybrid approach, which combines the 2, which is actually a really interesting way to potentially to deploy a solution. And so what are the considerations around those? Why would you go in one direction or the other? And maybe you do a little bit of both, like I said, with the hybrid. And then I'll focus in on some pre-launch pointers, like what you want to do, kind of the checklist of things to do before you go live with the program. And then really just wrap up with, if we've done all those steps, how it ensures a win-win for both a buyer and a supplier. And I guess I'm kind of assuming that everyone on the line is a buyer, is a corporate buyer, or on the buyer side of the equation, I guess you'd say, whether you're in treasury or other roles. But we look at this as a transaction between buyers and suppliers. But from a buyer perspective, also understanding there's a lot you need to do to ensure success that involves offering something to a supplier that's attractive. And I think we're going to start off with a poll question. I'll let Katie go ahead and conduct that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. The first poll question is going to be, where do you stand on your supplier financing, whether it's dynamic discounting or supply chain finance? So it's a single choice. Have a program in place in the process of implementing a new program, actively selecting a provider for a 2022 launch, or you haven't started considering yet. I'll give about 20 seconds to get the votes in. Looks like they're still rolling in, so I'll give another minute or 2 or
right.
not another minute,
This
another
is
couple
where-
seconds.
This is where I figure out if everyone's way ahead of me on this. So we'll see.
I'm gonna close it out. So it looks like a pretty even spread across the board on where everyone is today.
All right. Well, interesting. I would have expected, I guess, maybe more considering. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing an increase in companies that are considering a program that maybe hadn't before. You've always got that core group that has had something established. I mean, supply chain financing goes back 20 years. So there's obviously going to be a good number of companies that have a program in place. So I don't know. What do you think, Alex?
No, it's definitely true. And the good thing is, I mean, with the projects I've done, whether a company's in a place where they have a program in place or they just started implementing one, if you're using Kyriba, you can add it at any point. There's not a factor where it's off the table where you can't do it. You can pretty much add, supply chain financing or dynamic discounting it at any point. And some of the clients we've worked with have even implemented it while they're using another system. Maybe the other system doesn't meet all their needs or it doesn't have all the functionality. So Kyriba, with the capability it has through connectivity, can just absorb that data, and then you have better utilization of the information that's available.
Yeah, that's a good point. Our working capital modules, I think I can just close this, right, Katie? Yeah, our working capital modules are probably what I would call the best kept secret of Kyriba. We're really well known in treasury management, a leader in that space. And so most of our clients that are using the working capital are not just doing that, but they've added it on as an additional set of functionality so they can even better manage their cash. All right, a couple of perspectives on the supply chain. So I guess if I had a live audience, I'd be asking if anybody had tried to buy a car, an appliance, maybe some furniture recently, and ran into this issue of, capacity, like lack of inventory, slow inventory, delays. I was talking to a colleague yesterday who said he went in and he wanted to trade in his car and buy a new car. The dealer actually said, you should trade in your car today, even though we don't have anything on the lot for you, because then we can lock in your trade value. And then you're going to have to wait until the car comes in. And so as long as you can be without a car for 2 months, we have a deal. So it's crazy out there. And that's really just the physical supply chain and what everyone really thinks about, because that's what we can see. But I think what we really feel is the way that we're testing the financial supply chain. So over the last probably 18 months to 2 years, even though this has always been to some degree an issue, we've seen large corporates now trying to hold on to their cash. At the same time, we have suppliers that are looking for liquidity. They're getting squeezed. And now as we're in more of a recovery phase, you see that even more with suppliers where they're trying to keep up with orders, but it's difficult to do. So you've got this whole situation with supply chains kind of buckling. We're kind of hopefully on the back end of the virus variants, but there's always some kind of natural disaster. And I was thinking back, even early days of supply chain financing, one of the first deals I did or was involved with was when I was at JP Morgan. We were talking to one of our clients. If you remember what hard drives were, because we don't see those a lot anymore, but a hard drive manufacturer who really relied on 2 key suppliers in Thailand to get them a motor that was absolutely essential to building a hard drive. They had to have the motor or they couldn't go forward. And there were really only those 2 suppliers that could meet kind of their specifications. And that year, those suppliers got hit with typhoons. They went underwater. They got really behind. And even though they had contractually 60-day terms, the buyer, in this case, our customer, started paying those suppliers as either on approval of the invoice, or if I remember right, even prior to invoice approval, just to try to pre-fund them. So they essentially were becoming the bank in that relationship, and it's not something they wanted to do. And so, we're seeing a lot more cases now where suppliers are, maybe in trouble or distressed, and different reasons why a buyer would want to step in with some type of supplier finance program. So they don't necessarily have to be the bank, or if they are going to be the bank or be the funder, they get some kind of return for that early payment. Just one of the things I really wanted to note is I just, read an article this morning published by Global Trade Review that says the trade finance gap, or the gap between demand and supply for financing, is now at $1.7 trillion. That's increased 15% from 2018. So we just continue to see that trade finance gap, kind of get wider as we see more risk out there. Banks get, they can be very risk averse. They start to pull back their capacity. They pull back their support for some of these programs. And so we will have to try to innovate to make sure that suppliers get the liquidity they need. So I alluded to this a little bit with that example with the hard drive manufacturer, but what happens with it between buyers and suppliers, it really kind of creates a scenario where early payment solutions become very useful or maybe essential. And what I like to call is this push-pull relationship between buyer and supplier. So, buyers obviously want to hold on to their cash. They have a DPO, maybe a metric they want to hit, potentially even want to extend terms. At the same time, suppliers are trying to get paid early. So that's an extreme example of the hard drive manufacturer and their suppliers. But in any relationship, commercial relationship, there's this push-pull where you really need a way to solve for this without the buyer necessarily giving up too much or the supplier trying to give up too much. And so at Kyriba, we have a product hierarchy that addresses a lot of these concerns and enables both buyers and sellers or suppliers to achieve objectives. So what I want to focus on today is the buyer side, or the payable solutions of SCF, DD, or a hybrid of the two. But just also keep in mind that we do offer receivables and other types of solutions for sellers as well. So depending on which side of the equation you're on, one may be more applicable than the other. But let's just focus here. I will start with dynamic discounting as we get into this, go into supply chain finance, and then the hybrid. But we have to start even before that. And this is where I get into some of these factors of success and thinking about what needs to be considered prior to going forward. So there's an issue. You've got buyer and supplier, and you have suppliers that are in need of liquidity, but from a buyer perspective, what are your objectives? So think about your primary drivers. Let's see. No, this helps. Okay. So think about primary drivers. And what would you be looking to do? Is it maximizing returns? So do you have excess liquidity and you're looking to get a return? So if you're making early payments, maybe you have some static discounts that suppliers give you today, but how do you maximize that in a program sense? How do you strengthen your supply chain given the difficulties that those are in, the suppliers are in? On a call this morning with a client, and they alluded to the fact that they're spending so much of their time just trying to free up the bottlenecks. This is a procurement team, and how do they get product in a timely manner? And so as much as they're trying to focus on this type of objective, they're still trying to just make sure their supply chain is secure. And with financing, you can even strengthen that supply chain. But are there corporate social responsibility or environmental social governance initiatives that you want to layer in? Or is it just a matter of supporting that supplier that's in distress? So all these drivers can come into that decision process as you start to create an early payment program. With suppliers, there's a lot of considerations to be had around which suppliers are offered early payment. Another example I have today is that a customer that's looking at only putting a program in place for distressed suppliers. They're going to have some kind of a criteria that they go through to determine which one of those suppliers gets offered supply chain financing. But I think more often than not, it's a more broad approach of offering all suppliers the opportunity to get paid early. And I think part of that comes from the fact that, suppliers, they communicate. You may have supplier forums and different times that you bring suppliers to the table together. And so sometimes you just can't exclude anyone, and you want to make a more broad approach. But there's size, geography, lines of business, whether it's direct or indirect spend. And then finally, how would you fund these programs? So if you have your own capital to fund, how much? And how far would you take that? And is there cyclicality to it? And this will come into play when we consider a possibility of doing a hybrid program where you want to capture as much as you can up front. But if you run out of cash or you have other priorities that come up or other uses, you don't leave your suppliers without the early payment that they were expecting. Just going to pause it really quick. I don't know if Alex, if there's anything that you could add to that slide.
No,
Don't mean to put you on the spot, but
no, I think you covered
drink
most
break.
of it. I definitely think you covered most of it. You know, on the primary driver side of this, so the support supplier requests, you know, that's been a big thing with all the companies that we've worked with recently that have been looking at SCF is if they're a buyer, how do they lengthen their terms out to help, you know, optimize that? And a lot of the suppliers that we've worked with have been very reasonable with that. We haven't had, you know, in the past when I've done these types of projects, we've had very hard-nosed, you know, these are our terms, that's it.
Yeah.
Recently, though, you know, you mentioned the global situation that we're in, you know, suppliers have been far more reasonable and they've been adaptable to the requests and the issues that are going on with a lot of these, I don't want to say smaller businesses, but, you know, businesses that aren't in that, you know, $1 billion range, they're more in maybe the lower $1 million range. And I think that's been one of the big drivers that's let a lot of companies, you know, continue to, I don't want to say expand, but operate in our current environment. And then the other thing was under suppliers, you know, the offered to select groups of suppliers based upon, you know, strategic importance, size, geography, things like that. A lot of that stuff from what we've seen has kind of gone out the window as far as like geography or size. It's you go to wherever you can get your product from or whoever's going to give you the best terms. And with Kyriba's, the way Kyriba works with this, it doesn't matter where somebody's located or what size they are. You just work that into the system and you customize it to make it work for your specific setup in Kyriba, whether it's dynamic discounting or just supply chain finance. So I think that's one of the big, you know, it's one of those customization factors that you get with Kyriba that maybe you don't get with other pieces of software or other services.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. And that's kind of going back to, you know, whether you need external funding. So I can tell you from experience that most of the commercial and global banks will kind of cut you off at a certain size supplier. So their programs are a little bit more targeted. You know, number one, as a buyer, you have to be investment grade. And then number two, as a supplier, you might have to be selling at least $1 million in annual value that then becomes, you know, financeable spend for the bank. And so as you consider some of these suppliers and which suppliers you want to enroll, that can actually dictate what type of funding, you know, you would have to go out and get. So, yeah, and I've seen situations where a bank might fund a program within their you know, credit limits and their capacity, which can be a little more attractive price wise. And then you go to a third party, maybe a non-bank funder, and you would fund, you know, the rest of the supply chain, which could be, you know, 50 suppliers with half your spend kind of tied up in the bank program, and another 5,000 suppliers that might be left out of that program that you can then include. And because our platform's agnostic and you can handle multiple banks, multiple funders, then you can cover your entire supply chain.
Yeah, so, and that brings up the kind of the, and I don't mean to cut you off here, Mike, but that brings up some of the capabilities where Kyriba is a modular system. So specifically with supply chain finance, other modules that touch that are payments, deal capture, which a lot of people refer to as debt investment, and then also your cash positioning, and then the connectivity. So with all those modules included, it allows you to not just have a module that does supply chain finance, but it integrates it into your entire treasury system. Everywhere from wherever when the files come in to how your cash looks at the end of the day, based on the deals that you set up, who your suppliers are, and where your basically where your debt and your investment sits at that point in time.
Perfect, good stuff. The other thing that I wanted to just kind of layer into this is when you're doing a supplier finance program, it touches a lot of different stakeholders within the company. So always need an executive sponsor, just like any other project. That's typically, a CFO level. But where this may be thought of as a treasury procurement, solution or initiative, each one really has different responsibility and has to sign off on this type of a project to make it successful. So if you're checking boxes, you really have to check, treasury, where it's just tasked with maximizing returns or, monitoring their cash and working capital. It's procurement, those going to own the relationship. They're the ones that probably have to go out and negotiate the new terms. And so they need to understand what kind of tool they have to use to actually get those new terms in the form of an early payment program. And then AP is almost always, a little nervous about how this is going to change their role and whether the approval process for an invoice changes or how they reconcile. And so all these things have to be kind of considered. And I think we have a poll question related to this, which I think we'll go ahead and jump into.
Thanks, Mike. The second poll question is, who is involved in making the decision to do a SCF or DD program at your company? This is a single choice. So treasury, procurement, accounts payable, or all the above. I'll give about 15 more seconds. Votes are still rolling in here.
Yep, sounds good.
I'm gonna go ahead and close it out. So it looks like the majority is all the above and then accounts payable.
Wow, okay. Well, all of the above I expected, because it really is kind of decision by committee in most cases. Although treasury or procurement would almost always kind of have at least the decision that they take to the CFO maybe for sign off. But that's interesting. I think I probably influenced the decision just with my previous slide that everyone needs to be a part of it.
Yeah, no, definitely. But I mean, the groups that we mainly work with are procurement and AP. So the AP doesn't surprise me. And as far as making the decision, all of the above is obviously always a good option. But no, that's not surprising because this, obviously, with the amount of money you spend on treasury software and software to handle your SCF or dynamic discounting is usually it's something that's going to reach that level. So that definitely makes sense.
Yeah. I think Kyriba, we may be a little bit unique in that I'm just thinking of an example of a deal we're working through right now where it is led by procurement because they're the ones that are buying the software. But it will heavily impact treasury and the fact that treasury already uses our cash management solution. And so, they'd probably see an advantage to coupling that with the working capital platform. Whereas procurement really doesn't have any visibility or really have any impact on their day-to-day if they were to go outside of Kyriba. So it's interesting as that decision process goes forward. And speaking of decision process, so, as we've kind of laid a lot of that groundwork and we've thought about different considerations, the one thing that we'd probably key in on as you decide which track you want to go down, at least your primary solution for suppliers is, what's your cash position? Are you long cash or short cash? And, if as a corporate, you look and you say, we have a lot of excess cash, we need to deploy that, we're looking for a risk-free return, then dynamic discounting is the direction you'd want to go. If it's just the opposite, if you're looking to improve your working capital, hold on to that and improve on your DPO, then you secure the third-party funding, which would then fund your program. So this is kind of that decision point you would start with of who's going to make the early payment, and then how would we meet the objectives that we set in the previous slide. So with dynamic discounting, those are I guess we just categorize as long cash. Starting with a definition of dynamic discounting, I'm going to always assume at this point that most know this, but every company I talk to captures discounts in some way, but most of them are static. Most of them are on like a 210 net 60, something very typical that says for 10 days after the invoice is issued, I have that period of time to then capture the full 2% discount. After that, it's zero. After that, there's no real opportunity to capture a discount, and it's done on a manual basis. With dynamic discounting, use technology to kind of enable the ability to not only capture the full 2%, but also if the supplier demands it or supplier requests it, at any point in that additional 50 days of invoice tenor, there's an opportunity for an early payment. So the supplier can come in at day 20, and this just steps down every day at 0.04%. So it just breaks down that period of enabling a discount, and say day 20, they're going to take a 1.6% discount, and so on and so forth. So really two things are happening here. One, it's a technology solution. It requires a platform to make this a dynamic discounting relationship. But also I think it's important to know that, like, you don't step off a cliff if you don't approve your invoice for 12 days. There's still then that invoice made available to the supplier to get paid early. And many of these, frankly, when we see suppliers onboard to a program, they're saying that they want every invoice paid early. They have the option when they onboard, they can go automatic discount, everything gets paid early, or they can do it selectively and they can choose that day, that day and that discount amount. But what I've seen is that once you put this program in place, then you're capturing 100% of the discounts. You're not losing out, at 30, 40, 50% of the discount opportunities. So that's really kind of dynamic discounting, and is kind of a visual. And then we can talk quickly about the benefits. We've mentioned a risk-free return on excess cash. So that's the decision you made. You're looking for return on your cash. You're going to fund the program on your own. And so that's the primary objective for the buyer. You're also going to be reducing your cost of goods sold, because you're going to get that 2, 3, whatever % discount. Sometimes it can go up, sometimes it can go down, but you are actually capturing discounts to reduce your COGS. But let's not forget about the supplier side. So the suppliers we talked about, if they're in distress, they're getting squeezed, they're looking for liquidity. They're going to get an off balance sheet option to pull in some liquidity. And what it does is it creates a scenario where not only have they improved on their DSO or their working capital, but they get something that's very important, which is predictability of cash flow. So specifically those that are auto discounting, where everything gets paid early on approval, now they know essentially on day 10, every invoice is going to get paid. And then what that does is it really improves the relationship between buyer and supplier, and kind of one of the ways that you solve for that push-pull scenario that we talked about earlier. I just wanted to highlight an example of a success that we've had, recently with a company called scientist.com. This will put a little bit in perspective of maybe why it requires a platform to do something like this. It's probably obvious, but in this case, we have a customer of ours that has suppliers in 21 countries, and you can see this is pretty spread out, because it's still early days, but 216 suppliers are enrolled. So only about what is that, 10 per country. So that's basically saying we don't care what country you're in, as Alex mentioned. We can onboard you. Out of 2,600 invoices that have come across the platform, 2,200 have been paid early. So there's a high demand for suppliers on this program looking to get paid early, and they're getting paid for the majority of them right as the invoice is approved. So it's 60-day terms. The average discount taken is on day 53. But what I think is really interesting is where they've captured discounts of about $500,000, the return on their, on their cash is over 7%. It's almost 8%, which is unheard of in the market today. So that's why we talk about this is a really nice return on excess cash at very, very little or no risk.
Yeah, and speaking of that, Mike, just real quick on that previous slide.
Yeah, please.
Working with, like you had mentioned, so almost 20 or basically 10 suppliers per country, 2,600 uploaded invoices, and that's a repeatable number, because every year, every month, it's going to be the same. Very likely a lot of that is going through Kyriba Connectivity. It's not all being manually uploaded. So not only did they set up all the suppliers in Kyriba and they got all the invoices in, but they set up connectivity to all of these suppliers globally around the world to automate that, where you're no longer getting a paper invoice. It's going into the system. It alerts the users when they log in, and there's no longer a paper trail where you have somebody jotting a note down on it. It's already in the system and it's ready to be approved or reviewed from that standpoint.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of options, but most of our clients would definitely want these invoices to be uploaded automatically. So there's only so much drag and drop you want to do before you kind of get over that, right? All right. So the other scenario would be, short cash supply chain financing. So let's go through this. I'm gonna kind of keep this moving because I think are we doing okay on time? Maybe we're doing okay on time. Yep, we're doing okay. So supply chain finance, the difference here is the funder, so now instead of making the payment on your own, you introduce a funder, whether it's a bank or a non-bank financier, to pay the suppliers on your behalf. So it is a working capital credit facility. So from a buyer perspective, you do have to have a bank that's willing to fund an early payment program. And then the bank will step in, they'll provide the funding to the supplier, create the same win-win situation, and use a platform to do it with all the onboarding and everything that comes with it. But in this case, the bank is actually capturing the discount. So they're capturing a finance fee from the supplier. But it's okay because in this case, your objective is much different. Your objective as a buyer is to now improve your working capital by optimizing your payment terms. So think about the example I started with the hard drive manufacturer. They just wanted to get back to a 60-day payment. They'd completely kind of folded up that payment term in just support of their supplier. So their objective was just to get back to kind of normalized payment terms. But in most cases, buyers are looking to push their terms. So the example I have from this morning is a buyer or a company that's on 55-day terms. They know their peer group is much further out. They could go to 75 or 90 days based on analysis we'll do for them. And so they'll improve that working capital. The supplier, even though they're getting pushed out a little bit, because the liquidity, the cost of that liquidity is so much cheaper than what they might access on their own, that it creates a nice win-win for both parties, where the supplier's now getting paid early. They're giving up a pretty small finance charge, or what you might call a discount, to get access to that. And it's the same predictability of cash flow that we talked about before. But really the difference is the objective of the buyer. The supplier should not necessarily see a difference in their experience, both from a platform perspective as well as their access to liquidity. I guess the only thing that may change is the onboarding process. Because of banks involved, there can be some KYC documents that have to be collected. So supply chain financing, this is a really great success story that we like to talk about with Ashan. It's a French multinational retailer, but really when you look at the potential for the Kyriba platform, we like to talk about that we're bank agnostic, and we can handle very complex onboarding, very complex implementations. And when you're talking about 28 buyer entities, they didn't start with 28. I think it started with 4 or 5. But they've grown over the last couple of years to 28 buyer entities, have to date uploaded 41 million invoices automatically, obviously, or by integration. But also we've onboarded 24,000 suppliers. So, you can go from a pretty minimal program, I guess, or a targeted program. This is obviously where, when they were thinking about the considerations around how they wanted to deploy this, they want to deploy it to all their suppliers. So all their suppliers are taking part. The uploaded invoice value is $97 billion. So approaching $1 trillion, which is pretty crazy. All right. What would be, hey, Alex, what kind of would be if you were coming into something like this and doing an implementation, what's the lift here? What would you tell a buyer, kind of going into this? And like I said, maybe you approach it in an incremental fashion, but what's kind of going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, well, the one comment you made there, incremental fashion, would be my first approach. But anytime we're looking at like a supply chain finance type of project, we have to look at priorities, which upfront means, okay, what is the biggest bank we're dealing with? Who are the biggest suppliers we're dealing with? Let's focus on those, get those onboarded, get them in the system and functioning correctly. and then work our way down the chain. Now, obviously with this one, 28 buyer entities, that's a ton to deal with up front. So we would probably break that out into multiple phases. And then from there is where we would build, typically if we're doing a supply chain finance project like this, we're also going to be doing, bank statements and payments or other modules associated with it. So things like connectivity are going to be done ahead of time before we would actually get to this phase, which actually improves our success rate, because once connectivity is done with a bank, for example, we're getting bank statements, but then we're also going to be able to pull those invoices in or any other banking documents into Kyriba much quicker. So it's kind of multifaceted when you're looking at something of this size, but obviously the bank connectivity to get all of our information into the module, and then setting up the buyers, making sure our suppliers are enrolled, that they know how to access the portal, that we train our clients on how to onboard more suppliers down the road. It's not, supply chain finance is not a module where we're just going to set it up and then we go, okay, you're good, off and run. It's something where we train you to continually grow the module out. Obviously, in some circumstances like this, you're not going to add 28 buyers overnight. So that's something where you might need assistance with that. But the module build out, like you said, it's incremental. It typically, for something of this size, is not going to be standalone. So we're going to have additional capability there through connectivity and the other modules. And then it's the training the client to understand and work on the module outside of having us there for hand holding or to provide, tips and tricks.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, the platform would allow the buyer to release 1 or 100 or however many suppliers at a time. So yeah, it can be fed out. And from our perspective, we provide the technology, but we can also provide the onboarding team. And so working with Alir, we can actually handle that as part of the service that we provide. So yeah, don't think of Kyriba as just the platform, but think of us as the support for supplier onboarding. We can also support dialogue and actually even source funders for these programs. And in this case, I don't think it doesn't state this on the slide, but I think there are 5 different funding banks that are connected to this, funding different invoices in different regions.
Yeah, and I know you're going to talk about it here in a few minutes, but the hybrid approach, dynamic discounting and SCF together, typically, and I've seen it over time as well, where you might start with a client who's doing supply chain financing to start, where they have, 5 banks or 4 banks, and they have a ton of buyer entities and a ton of suppliers. But over time, they're going to grow into where they want to do the dynamic discounting. And I know we're getting into that next, but this would be a prime example of that, where they could very easily grow into the dynamic discounting because of the savings and the value they're seeing just on the SCF side alone.
That's right. One could feed the other. It's a very likely scenario. Yep. I did want to just call this out from Ashan Group. So it's interesting as we get a quote from a client reference. What they actually highlighted was not how much working capital they generated or not what benefited them, but the feedback they got from suppliers. And so that just tells me they've done this right. They've looked at their suppliers, they've done something that benefits the supplier. Then obviously in an indirect fashion and a direct fashion, it can benefit the buyer. But when you talk about meeting expectations around visibility, simplicity, transparency, those are things we really like to hear, because then we know, that's one of the reasons you end up with 24,000 suppliers coming onto a program. Like I said, I've been involved with bank programs, and this goes back maybe kind of where the technology wasn't very good, where some of this was very, very manual, but you're happy with 20 suppliers, let alone 20,000 suppliers.
Yeah, no, and that's 100% right. I mean, I remember not even 10 years ago, my first company I worked at, we were still doing paper invoices, running around, putting them in filing cabinets. And like I said, I started with Kyriba on the other side, where I was on the business side. We were implementing Kyriba, and we saw the value in that, where all of a sudden we didn't have filing cabinets full. All we had to do was log in, look at it, find the invoice we needed, and you were off and running.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so we've teased this a little bit, and then hopefully that keeps people on the line. But I think I really like to talk about a hybrid approach. I don't think there's a one size fits all necessarily for any corporate. And certainly, what I like to say is that all benefits of dynamic discounting are nullified if suppliers don't get paid as requested. And I talked about, one of the key benefits of these early payment programs is the predictability for the supplier. If you are funding, and I take this, my thought process here is if you started with dynamic discounting, I've seen this time and time again, even sometimes before the program goes live, they set their objectives and they say, hey, we have excess cash. We want to get a return on it. Let's do dynamic discounting. 3 months later, or maybe less, the CFO comes in and says, hey, we're going to acquire a new company. We don't have any excess liquidity, and it's like game over. So we really want to make sure that, especially if you've launched the program and you've onboarded suppliers, there's always a backstop in terms of funding to make sure the suppliers get paid. So a hybrid solution is the way to do that. As a corporate, you deploy as much available cash or liquidity as you want, and you gain that return as expected. But at whatever point you decide that you're not going to make the early payment, we have a third party that could come in and fund at the same rate on the same day, exactly the same experience for the supplier. And that's really how this works. That's really what's key to this. I don't have a lot of detail to share today, only to say that at Kyriba, we can do this. We have third-party funders that are ready and willing. And just think about it from a cyclicality standpoint. During the course of a quarter, I would typically see like that excess liquidity being deployed in month 1, maybe in month 2. But when you get into the third quarter and you start to look and say, you know what, we should start holding back those early payments, improve our cash on our balance sheet. That's where you can really negatively impact your supplier, because that's exactly the time where they want to pull in the cash. They want revenue recognition and the benefits of getting paid early. And so it's essential that you have a third-party bank that will do that. And the reason that they will do that, that's the question I can get asked sometimes, is, well, why would a bank only fund like 1 month of the quarter? Why are they only, fund at the end of the quarter? And the reason is if a bank can fund at the same rate as a dynamic discounting program, remember I said, on day 20, there's 40 days left and there's a 1.6% discount. That's like, I think 14+% APR. That's multiples of what a bank is used to capturing on their programs. And so there's always a funder that will step in, even if it's on a hit or miss basis, or only at the end of the quarter, that will step in and get that kind of return on their capital. They're definitely not used to getting. And again, the suppliers already agreed to the program, so it's a win-win for actually all 3 parties at that point. Just a quick flow on that though. As we say, that the traditional dynamic discounting is a great way to support the supply chain. But if at any point there's that decision point, right? And this is where Kyriba is a little bit unique, where if we're managing cash and we have cash pools, we'll have visibility to the availability of cash for the program that's been dedicated to the program. And so then we can trigger, maybe plan B where the supplier is paid via an SCF solution and a bank funder. All right, I'm going to move into some of the pre-launch pointers that I think are important. And the first one is deciding on a partner. So we've probably hit on this quite a bit through the presentation. This is a little bit laced with, obviously kind of some of the things that Kyriba can do, but I do think it's essential, whatever partner is selected, to make sure that, these boxes can be checked, starting with the platform. Do you get support to design a program and, come up with a strategy? Alex mentioned training of staff and using the platform, but not only that, but just understanding the benefits of the solution. If a supplier asks, what's going on with this? What's the communication and the outreach that goes on to the supplier to educate them, to get them to participate in the program? A lot of times the critical nature of this is the suppliers are onboarded onto a program, even if they're not using it. But if you're looking to extend terms, for instance, the supplier at least knows they have access to that capital if they get in a situation where they need it. And that can be the difference in you negotiating the new term or not.
Yeah.
And there's different program reporting and review and fun. And I've talked a little bit about the funding options, but I really think the multi-bank funding platform is essential. Alex, did you have a comment?
Yeah, and so everybody's aware. So the screen you're seeing down here in the bottom right, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, this would be the supplier screen that they would see from their end, correct?
Yes, I believe it
Yes.
is.
Yeah, so this would be the screen that your suppliers would see when they would come into the portal to actually look at whether payments been made, what the outstanding balance is, what the total balance is, things like that. So this is what your actual suppliers would see coming in, and this is part of, like Mike said, the training that I mentioned earlier. Part of the training that we provide you is how to set up your suppliers and explain to them, here's where you come to view all the information, the total outstanding balance, the outstanding balance per month, how to request an early payment. All that stuff is part of the training, so you're prepared to do it on your own without any input from Kyriba or from the implementation team, who might be 6 months out from completing your setup. So that's all part of the implementation. It's part of the process of getting suppliers onboarded. Is we will help you do several of them and be there for you for several more in case questions or issues do come up.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. And as you can see, there's a little button that says, excuse me, request early payment. And if we're doing a demo, we could show you, but that's where suppliers can kind of model how much liquidity they need or which invoices they want to discount. There's a lot of options built into it. On the funding side, I did want to just call out a few best practices around funding, the considerations you go through, and what you look at. We feel like it's important, number one, that you eliminate single bank risk. Even if there's one bank that's funding your program today, make sure you have the ability to plug and play another bank if necessary. Because as I stated, the reason that trade finance gap is widening is because banks are pulling back. And so if there's a situation, where a bank decides they're going to, draw back on a program and maybe reduce the size, you can always plug in a second bank or replace that bank and not have to disrupt your program as far as the platform goes. You also can drive some competition between different funders, which drives lower pricing. And as much as the buyer, you don't pay the finance charge, you certainly want to have, the best option for your suppliers. And the lower the price, the more suppliers will participate. And so they'll see a benefit from that. Rewarding multiple banking relationships. That Aushon example was a great one because they have 5 relationship banks that are plugged into the platform. So then you kind of leverage that to make sure that suppliers are getting a benefit based on location or currency or so forth. We work with non-bank funders as well. And so it's what I'm seeing really in that realm is a lot of non-bank funders coming in to say, hey, we know that the banks have left out, like I said, the 5,000 suppliers that didn't meet their criteria. We can come in and fund those suppliers and really then broaden the reach of your supplier finance program. And, ironically, it's those smaller suppliers that really need the capital that have been left out of these programs over the years. So, that's really where I would emphasize the need for multiple funders and not necessarily just a relationship bank.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that, Mike. And in some cases, we've had a couple clients that they call them private funders, quote unquote, where it's no longer bank or financial institution based. And some of those have been the best ones that we've set up, is because they don't have standard policies that are built into their banking practices, and allows them more lateral movement when it comes to providing funding and giving terms.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. These are non-bank funders. They've really grown over the years. They have more flexibility, like I said, on the buyer side as far as ratings. They may price a little bit higher, but when you're talking about the lower half of your supply chain and your list of suppliers, they can do something that's still very attractive for that group of suppliers as you segment them out. But really the bottom line here is just to have control and ownership of who's funding your program. And I really do feel like that's the best practice versus just being at the mercy of maybe one of your relationship banks and using their platform. I think the other thing that I hit on earlier as you're selecting a provider is the ability to do planning and analysis. So these are just some of the activities that can really maximize your ROI. Doing a specific segmentation, understanding who your suppliers are, but not only who they are, but where they're located, maybe estimating what their cost of borrowing might be to just determine whether you've got an attractive program from a price perspective for your suppliers. But you can also create a business case for internal approval. You may have made some assumptions and you can validate some scope through that analysis. And then the marketing and education, which I think we've already talked about, but these are all part of that planning process, that pre-launch process that can be really critical and important. The one last thing I wanted to call out as we talk about supply chain financing specifically is the Financial Accounting and Standards Board has finally, after I think a couple of years of anticipation, come out and said that they are going to release some disclosure requirements around supply chain financing. So be aware that that's coming. They've kind of just basically said, hey, we're going to come out with, disclosure requirements. They haven't necessarily said exactly what those are, other than when you're reporting on your your financials, you will need to disclose that you do supplier financing. And that what it does is it really kind of impacts sometimes the rating agencies and some of those investors that are looking at your company to understand whether your payables are backed up by some kind of supplier finance program. I don't expect it to make any changes as far as classification from an accounting standpoint. And I've listed a couple of the key considerations when it does come to accounting. And these are just tripwires that you don't want to stub your toe on. But as you go into a supplier finance program, it's always important, and this is based on PwC's guidance, that you don't push your terms out beyond an industry norm, number one. The only cases we've ever seen over the years where there's been a change in classification of a trade payable to debt on your balance sheet has been because companies have gone out 240, 360 days, way beyond their peers, way beyond the normal business, the normal course of business. And then the other thing would be that the payable doesn't really change. Like you have an invoice, you have a set term, and you approve that invoice, and the financing is based on those invoicing or on those invoice parameters. And specifically that the financier doesn't artificially extend the term or that you pay any financing to provide your supplier with a quicker payment, but that you get additional benefit of longer terms. So if it's a 90-day invoice and the financing goes for 120 days, then it's a no-no. So just a couple of things to point out, and just keep your eye out if you do have a program in place or you're looking at considering a program, that you are aware of some of the finance or accounting considerations that are out there. Most providers are very well aware of this and will guide you, but would also probably tell you to consult your accountant. All right, well, we've covered a lot of territory here. I hope this has been beneficial, but really just goes back to that, creating the win-win scenario for buyer and supplier. These are programs that solve for the push-pull relationship. They give buyers that excess cash or return on their cash, depending on that objective. But consistent, predictable cash flow for suppliers is really key. And that's really why these programs have been put in place over the years, and why they continue to be popular. Whether we innovate around, whether you go with a very traditional SCF program, you do something that's a little bit more, sexy, that's dynamic discounting, or you do a combination of the two, it's really all about the supplier and delivering that liquidity for the supplier and creating the win-win. So appreciate your attention. I think I'm going to turn it back to Alex. I'm sorry, not to Alex.
Katie.
Thank you, Mike.
My apologies. So Katie's, I think, got a little bit of a next up, and then we'll take some questions.
Perfect. So yeah, the next session and the last session of the ETE conference is going to be this in-house banking and managing organizational financial structures. And that is going to be happening right after this. So in 5 minutes at 3 p.m. I just dropped in the chat the link to register if you guys are interested. So feel free to hop over to that next session. But I'm not seeing any questions that have come through in the chat or in the Q&A. But just as I'm finishing up the final wrap up, feel free to submit any questions. We can hop on or stay on the line here. Or Mike and Alex's emails are listed on the screen. So you can take those down and email over a question if you do have any. But I wanted to thank Mike and the Kyriba team once again for partnering with us on this presentation, as well as Alex from Alir for a great presentation. We really appreciate it. And also thank you to everyone for joining us today. We would love to stay connected with you all in the future. So feel free to follow Alir on all social media platforms. We're really engaged on LinkedIn, as well as just engage with us with the hashtag ETE 2021 on Twitter and LinkedIn to be entered into a drawing for some Alir swag and gift cards throughout the event. So I want to thank everyone again.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, again for having us. Thanks, Alex. It was great to team up with you today, and I look forward to hearing from anyone, offline. Please reach out.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Katie.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
All right.